Hey there. In my last video, although it wasn't strictly speaking about holding on to rational frames of mind and evaluatory processes, it was very much related to those topics. And I thought this might be a good follow-up for that conversation. And so today I'd like to talk about imposing structure where none exists, or certainly where none needs to exist. Most of us are, by and large, pretty big fans of rules and order, even when a part of us seeks to shrug them off, even when our goals include not being so closely bound by them. But order, organization, boundaries are in large part a major means of understanding and categorizing the world. And we rely on this approach in order to interact with our environment, with other people, with ideas. And so we are rule manufacturing machines. In mundane practice, this sort of behavior involves seeing something or doing something, determining what the cause, the proximal cause and effect of those things are, creating a rule in our heads that say, if X, then Y, and then trying to extend that rule outward to cover as many different but related scenarios as we can. And as far as learning paradigms go, it's not a bad one, but it's not necessarily the best when we're talking about spiritual practices, although it does have its place. And certainly in my practice, I constantly find myself struggling to walk this line between being too rule and cognitive focused at the expense of woo and emotion. And so if I'm walking this wiggly line where I'm constantly self-correcting to keep me on a path that I think is most beneficial and with which I am comfortable enough to progress on, all the while avoiding falling into a second trap by overthinking my tendency to overthink. Many of our paths, regardless of the specific details of whatever pagan practice you follow or are interested in following, almost certainly adhere to some structure. When we talk about some of the main benefits of forging our own paths, one of the things that comes up is the flexibility, the freedom from being forced or feeling forced to adhere to dogma that doesn't work for you or doesn't apply. But that freedom from externally generated structure, by and large, tends to result in us simply creating our own structure. It doesn't necessarily throw off the shackles of organization. And I, for one, really wouldn't be that interested in throwing off structure entirely, because I think it's a cornerstone of my practice that contributes significantly to what works well for me. It provides a scaffold on which to build. The structure of what already exists in my practice provides me with a blueprint I can follow to extend that practice. This structure can be found in the design of ritual, which in the majority of practices that are even loosely based on Wicca are going to involve things like casting a circle, raising particular sorts of energies or inviting those energies into circle, communing with the divine. And those subcomponents sort of bookend the working that you're doing that day. But there are internally generated structures that I've imposed in my own practice as well. The way I engage with the different aspects of self that I tap into and circle, there's structure in that. There's also structure in the way I approach and then perform the act of projecting my consciousness into different aspects of self on different planes while I'm working. I've created structure around how I access different realms or geographic locales, how I design spells. And when I say that I impose these structures on my practice, I don't mean that these are always conscious decisions. The details can be conscious, but the urge to organize, that's innate. Structure at this level can really actually help build the cohesiveness of ritual and does contribute to its efficacy. I don't think that this tendency to impose structure on magical working or spiritual work is arbitrary or merely a byproduct of human preferences for structure. It provides a substrate for associative learning that helps you get into the right frame of mind. There's something magical and soothing about reciting the same or one of a handful of circle castings, acknowledging or calling quarters, elements, deity, whomever or whatever you call. The act of lighting candles or setting up crystals or sprinkling herbs at particular times in particular orders provides a substrate on which you can hang everything else in your working. And, as I've mentioned before, anchors what you're doing in the physical, even as you work in mental or astral planes alongside that. Structure also provides a means to build on your personal theories regarding what works and how it works, what is helpful to you and why. In part because when the general outline, the general context, and many of the acts that you engage in stay the same, it's much easier to attribute a particular kind of outcome or some unexpected event to whatever details occurred during that ritual or spell that were different than usual. Where I think structure becomes a little insidious, though, is when it slips sideways and you begin to impose it on everything you do, or you limit everything you try to that which fits the structure that you've already built. I have, probably quite obviously, a fairly psychological and neurological view of my practice, and my understanding of processing, thought, memory informs how I extend that practice. They are part of that structure upon which I build. But not only can I not claim to have a full and complete understanding of how the things I do work, I am as close to positive as I can be that the theoretical foundation upon which I do build most of my practice is nowhere near complete enough to justify my only relying on that in pursuing my path. And so by demanding that anything I do conform to the structural expectations of my scientific background or whatever came before now in my practice, I am massively limiting opportunity to discover new things and expand in directions that I have not yet anticipated. In other words, I need to leave some room for the woo in my practice. I need to resist the urge to behave as though I have the mechanisms all figured out. Another trap when it comes to this tendency to impose structure is making the mistake of assuming that everything else, whether these are thought forms, guides, or gods, demand or expect structure themselves. Let me give you an example of where I've fallen into this trap. For a long time, I was working exclusively with the feminine divine in the form of the archetypal triplet of maiden, mother, and crone. Trinities have always very much appealed to me, and I've always held 3 to be a sacred number as a result. But eventually, I developed a relationship with a goddess who is now my matron. But I realized at some point that from time to time, it really made more sense for me to align myself and my working on that triple aspect of maiden, mother, crone. And yet I didn't do so because in some weird way, without ever really consciously thinking about it, some part of me had decided that the right way of doing things was to move in the direction of greater specificity. And in terms of gods, that meant that going back to working with more generic archetypal figures was in some way a regression, wasn't appropriate, or wasn't allowed. But that's pretty ludicrous when I stop and think about it, certainly for me. That was just me imposing structure where it didn't belong. And when I started examining other things I was doing, I recognized that I'd been falling into this trap of jamming a particular blueprint in places where it did not fit, where there was no natural relationship between the rule set I had developed and the thing to which I was trying to apply it. Those sticky structural tendrils had crept into all sorts of corners where they didn't belong. And so, as a result and a reaction to this, I obviously think more about this issue of structural imposition. But I also now have something in my practice that I call a wild night, which is a night where, once a month, I violate all of the structural norms that I generally impose in ritual, and engage in practices that I would otherwise be deeply skeptical of, make me a little uncomfortable by how risque they are. I think I'll go into more detail regarding my wild night in a future video because it certainly is an experience that will fill a video on its own. And instead, I'll simply leave you with the suggestion that you might get a great deal out of taking a close look at where you apply structure and limitation in your practice. Are there particular areas where you stringently adhere to some sort of dogma that you may have developed yourself, but that hasn't changed for a long time? Are there ideas that are sort of interesting to you, but that you never engage with because they really do violate your core beliefs about how things actually work? And then ask yourself what the worst thing that could happen is if you chucked those limitations out the window for a night, if you broke those rules anyway. I think this turf is fertile ground for expanding your practice in bold directions and can be a hell of a lot of fun to boot. Anyway, I'd like to thank everybody who popped by to give this a listen and wish you a wonderful wild night.